Cosmopolitanism for me is about a willingness, a desire to encounter people who are different from you, both at home and abroad. And the point of that is that each of you has something to bring to the other. So there'd be no point in my cosmopolitan encounters with other people if I had nothing to bring. And what I have to bring is my roots.
Join us for Straight Ahead, the Omni American podcast. Welcome to Straight Ahead, the Omni American podcast. I'm Greg Thomas, joined by my co-host in Israel, Aryeh Tepper. Our final guest of season 2 is philosopher and public intellectual Kwame Anthony Appiah. He maintains a weekly ethics column in the New York Times Magazine and has been a professor of philosophy at NYU and his law school for the past decade. Appiah is also the president of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. For me, Aryeh, this episode holds special meaning because Appiah has influenced my thinking since the 1990s. I particularly appreciate how he told stories from his life throughout the episode.
Anthony Appiah, Greg, is a rooted cosmopolitan. He explains present-day Ghana, the mentor-client relationship, via examples from ancient Rome. His mind travels freely through time and space. He has a Ghanaian father and a British mother, and he's particularly at home in certain particular contexts, but he thinks broadly and humanely. I might disagree with him about certain social issues, but I would be a fool not to recognize his excellence and his importance in an increasingly globalized world in which cultural intelligence is becoming a necessity.
Enjoy. Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be talking to you.
So we'll begin with a easy question. So in 2024, what do you think the function and value of philosophy is?
Philosophy is a lot of different things. Some people are working on the metaphysics of constitution, what it is for something to be a part of something. Those questions are extremely interesting, at least to me, but they're not interesting to everybody, and I'm not sure they're very important for the lives of most people. So there's work within philosophy that I think it's reasonable to say, come if you're interested, but don't feel you have to know about this. But then I think there's work in philosophy that's of enormous importance because to everybody who can access it, and it's the responsibility of philosophers to make it available because it's helpful in the thing that Western philosophy started out to be, which is thinking about how to live. Philosophy is a way of life. And you can see that absolutely clearly, before Socrates and Pythagoras and so on, and afterwards in Plato and Aristotle, and then in the Roman Stoics and so on. I mean, Cicero's philosophy is about, how to live. Aristotle's philosophy, at least the parts of it in the ethics and the politics, are about how to live together. The thing that's the reason why we're the top species on this planet is because we can share information with one another. And we can share information I can share information with Aristotle, who's long dead. I can share information with contemporary Chinese philosophers working in Hong Kong and Singapore and the mainland of China. And as a result, we can build on each other's learning and knowledge to create impossibly complex structures of thought. And when people devote their lives to thinking about ethical questions or political, philosophical questions, they can make progress with them and they can report the progress back to the rest of us. These are domains in which there is knowledge to be had, and acquiring the best knowledge can be very difficult and can require a lot of work. But then it's knowledge. it's somebody's discovered an important truth, and that truth needs to be made available to everybody, because at least to the extent that it's a truth that's relevant to living their lives. So I think when I started in philosophy, which is a long time ago now, I don't think American philosophers were particularly focused on their role in providing those ideas for people to help people live their lives. We were sort of in a post-Dewey world, and the philosophers people admired were people like Quine, whose work was in philosophy of language and logic, and was of no, I mean, I find it very interesting, but I completely would have thought it bizarre if my mother had asked me to explain it to her, because it would be useful for her life. It wouldn't have been any use to her in her life. So, I, as a philosopher, I value all the work, including the work that isn't very public-facing, but it's really important, I think, for the profession that some of us at least do the public-facing work of translating what we've learned and making it helpful. Not in order to tell people what to do, but in order to help them think about what they should do. So that's incredibly urgent now. There's a very good book. It's probably one of his least known books, by Cornel West, called The American Evasion of Philosophy, which is about how in the mid-20th century philosophers drifted away from that role that was central in the thinking of someone like Dewey, of being a guide to public life. Now, Dewey was a Democrat, fortunately, so, I mean, not a big D Democrat, though he was a big D Democrat as well. So he was not, he understood that his job wasn't to tell people what to do. His job was to help people think about what to do. He wasn't an authoritarian kind of philosopher. But he did care about people thinking about how to live, and he had views about that. And some of his views were very influential, and they changed American education and so on. So there was this period when that was not valued. But now I think it is valued again, and the Committee on Public Philosophy of the American Philosophical Association is a really active committee, and people can now actually name some philosophers who have helped them think about their lives.
By and large, that intuition that philosophy should help us live our lives is based upon an understanding of ourselves, where we can separate between the intellect and the passions, and we can use our minds to regulate our passions. We can be thoughtful about the relationship between the two, and then a whole network of consequences when we think these things through. However, there is, even if we go back before the American story of the mid-20th century, there's a larger modern story of arguing that the passions are fundamental, that really we can't think rationally about our ends, that we have to base our political architecture and the way we understand ourselves upon the emancipation and perhaps the emancipation of the passions, and then take our bearings from that. How do you respond to that reading of the relationship between the two, the intellect and the passions?
Right. So reason, Hume says reason is and should be the slave of the passions. And his thought was that, it's part of a whole structure of thought that begins in roughly around the time of Hume in Europe, in which there's a very sharp divide made between facts and values are somehow thought to be connected with emotion, passion, feeling, and facts are the sorts of things that can be settled independently of feeling and so on. And I just think that way of dividing reality up is deeply unhelpful. We can reason, first of all, the most obvious point, the point that would have been obvious to anyone who read Aristotle, is that our feelings are reason responsive.
Right.
We fear things because we judge them to be dangerous. It's insane to fear something unless you make certain judgments about it. It's not. And of course there are many pathologies of that sort. Phobias are precisely pathologies of feeling, where you are afraid of something that it makes no sense to be afraid of. So reasons our feelings are reason responsive, just as our beliefs are. And the idea that that you can, as it were, feel anything you like, just doesn't make any sense. Right. If it isn't responsive to facts about danger, it isn't fear. And if it isn't sensitive to the needs and concerns of others, it isn't love. And so I think that that the vision of the world leads to a kind of anything goes view about feelings, which is just not a proper understanding of what feelings really are. And it's also true, on the other hand, that it leads to a view about beliefs that I think is mistaken, because beliefs too are things, beliefs are also obviously reason responsive. They're responsive to evidence and argument. But some beliefs are so remote from evidence and argument that it's not clear that we can come to conclusions about them that are going to be widely accepted or certainly universally accepted. I mean, central to many religious traditions are beliefs that seem to me it's not the sort of thing that you're going to take or leave because somebody makes an argument.
Right.
I was raised in a Protestant family. I say Protestant because my parents belonged to two different Protestant denominations, and I'm no longer a theist. But the transition from one to the other was not really about arguments. It was a shift in, as it were, my perspective on the world, and it happened very slowly and gradually, and then suddenly. I mean, there was a moment when I realized I didn't believe anymore. And so that's belief too is also more complicated than just saying, oh, well, you can settle these things by evidence or by rational argument. A lot of what we believe affects what the evidence means to us. If you think the CDC is part of a global conspiracy to undermine the health of the United States, then you'll respond differently to what they say about viruses and masks and vaccines than you will if you think that they're like the rest of us, people trying to do their job, occasionally making mistakes, but trying to help us look after our health. So I think, in a way, people exaggerate the significance of reason in coming to agreement about facts and understate the significance of reason in coming to judgments about feelings.
That's fascinating. Before the episode began, Professor Appiah asked us to please call him Anthony. So all of our viewers, So
thank you,
Anthony. You mentioned in your answer that if he had read Aristotle, and I know in your writing you freely move through the Roman playwrights and Roman history to understand Ghana, present day Ghana, and virtue, the language, et cetera, et cetera. However, that openness is not really. It's difficult to find today among Western intellectuals. Why do you think that's the case?
I increasingly am conscious of the fact that my life has been one of enormous privilege. And one of the enormous privileges was growing up in a multi-religious, a multinational family that valued learning from both of the main traditions that I grew up with, which were the traditions of Ashanti and the traditions of England. And so I sort of can't ignore things from elsewhere because that's my parents brought us up in this way. More than that, again, a great privilege, as I say, not multi-religious. I don't just mean that my mother was an Anglican and my father was a Methodist. I have a Jewish husband. I have one of my favorite uncles is Lebanese and a Lebanese Muslim. I have many Jewish cousins in England. So I have a Chinese brother-in-law, and one of my nephews is the father of a child whose mother is Russian, and Norwegian brother-in-law, and Nigerian brother-in-law. I mean, we live across nations, and it would be bizarre not I mean, how could I not learn from things in other places if I've got members of my family in those other places? But I also feel, and again, this is an important change in American philosophy, we are now definitely more committed to recognizing the plurality of sources of philosophical insight. So in my global ethics course, I teach Confucius and Mencius, I teach Al-Ghazali, as well as John Rawls and so on. So, and nobody thinks that's strange, as far as I can tell, which I think they would have thought if I'd done that 30 years ago. So when people don't do that, I'm puzzled, because an intellectual is somebody who wants to understand things. I mean, intellegere means to understand. And if there are people out there who understand things you don't understand and they don't happen to be in your place, why on earth would you not try and reach out to them? If the object of the exercise is to understand things, and Confucius understands something that I don't understand, why wouldn't I read Confucius? So, I mean, and now I can, because I don't read Chinese, but now there are beautiful translations of Confucius, and there are beautiful translations of Al-Ghazali, and not just translation, but secondary literatures which can introduce you, so you can get access to them. We're very lucky to live in such a time. I mean, that's the main joy of our time. The main bane of our time is that there's too much, and so we can't read it all. And I feel, gosh, I wish I knew more about almost anything anyone mentions to me. But I know I only have, a few decades left, and I'm going to be able to read only a few thousand books in that time. So, So I think it's sort of natural. I was lucky to be raised in a way that meant that I couldn't possibly have ignored what was going on outside the tradition that I went to university in. But I think it's also sensible, even if you didn't have that good fortune. And of course, many of the people who have done the most important work in, say, making Confucius available are Americans who grew up in America and learned Chinese and and did the work. They didn't do it because they were in China, or because not necessarily because they knew anyone Chinese. It's because they thought it was worth doing. So they didn't have the privilege of having the push that I had, but they pushed ahead anyway.
Well, it seems to me, Anthony, that both based on your own upbringing and the diversity of your own familial and communal background, plus the depth of your many decades of study, which is reflected in both your scholarly work as well as your public intellectual work, that it gives a very strong foundation for one of the key ideas that you posit and explicate, and that is cosmopolitanism. Now, for me, you have been deeply influential, both in terms of in the 90s, when I was going through what I call an Afrocentric period. Mm-hmm. It was your work constructively critiquing Afrocentricity as kind of a mirror image of Eurocentrism that caused me to look at things in a different way. Another idea of yours that's been very influential on me, and that I've used and made reference to throughout the years, is rooted cosmopolitanism. So if you could explain to our audience what rooted cosmopolitanism is and means. And also, I'm wondering whether or not when you either came up with the term or adopted or adapted the term, you were trying to counterstate the anti-Semitic notion of a rootless cosmopolitan that Stalin and others have levied against Jewish folks.
Yes. Well, certainly it's always nice to be able to combat bigotry. And there's a lot of it around. And the idea of the rootless cosmopolitan was one of the great anti-Semitic tropes, both of the Stalinists and actually of the Nazis. So it's good to be able to bash away at the wrongness of all that. But I think it's a deep misunderstanding of the attractions of cosmopolitanism to think that it's about not liking your home, basically, right? Or it's about distancing yourself from your home, or alienating yourself from your home. Cosmopolitanism for me is about a willingness, a desire to encounter people who are different from you, both at home and abroad. And the point of that is that each of you has something to bring to the other. So there'd be no point in my cosmopolitan encounters with other people if I had nothing to bring. And what I have to bring is my roots, as it were. I like, in the book, I quote a remark by American woman, lived in Paris, rose is a rose is a rose. So
Gertrude Stein?
Gertrude Stein, yes.
Okay.
She said, what's the point? What would be the point of roots if you can't take them with you? I like that. So she's born in California. She runs a salon in Paris. I think it's very crucial to understanding that the point of cosmopolitanism is the value of encounter. But encounter is an activity between, a minimum of two consenting adults. You have something to bring as well as that. So why would someone who thinks that every human being matters, which I think is one of the central thoughts of cosmopolitanism, but also that people are allowed to be different, why would you not think that your form of difference, the place you come from, isn't also valuable? And so, but not because you want everybody to be like you. So the kind of opposite form of universalism is the kind of universalism that says, I want everybody to end up like me or like us here. And my thought is, A, boring, not an interesting world. B, impossible. It's not going to happen. Humans generate forms of difference all the time. There are new kinds of difference all the time. We see this in the world of our identity politics. If you, when I was growing up, there were lesbians and gays and straight people. Now we say LGBTQIA, and those people keep adding things to that. That's fine. It's how things go. But people aren't going to settle into one identity. We're not all going to end up, I know Catholic means universal, Catholic Church, but we're not all going to end up as Catholics. We're not all going to end up as Muslims. We're not all going to end up as atheists. And if we did all end up as atheists, we'd all end up as different kinds of atheists. We'd have other things we disagreed about. So humans, and we make difference not individually, but together. So we do it in churches and temples and synagogues, and we do it in clubs, and we do it in fan clubs. The way that fans of the Yankees behave is different from the way that fans of the Mets behave, and meant to be so. They want to be different from each other. So human beings are constantly generating forms of difference. And if you try to homogenize us, as I say, A, boring, but B, it's not going to happen. And when people have tried to make it happen, you get Stalinism, you get the 100 Years' War, you get the American, part of what's going on in the American Civil War is a struggle about difference. And it's very bloody when you do that. The European wars of religion, the English Civil War, probably up to a quarter of well, maybe that's an exaggeration, but 15-20% of the British population of the British Isles died because of battle and the wounds of battle and the diseases that come when you disorganize society and destroy fields and take down ordinary life. So I think that's one of the sources of liberalism. You can see this in Montaigne's living through the wars of religion in France. And Montaigne was a Catholic who had Protestant brothers, converts. You can see this there. He's thinking, we're not going to settle this by becoming the same, and we're not going to settle this by fighting with one another. So we have to learn to live with one another. And if we're going to learn to live, why not enjoy it? why not take pleasure in the reasonable range of difference? So that's but bringing something yourself. So you're rooted somewhere. Everybody comes from somewhere or somewheres. Some of us grew up in a couple of places, but everybody has roots, and they can and they may be They may be literally deracinated because they're a refugee or an asylee, but they bring something with them, right? They're not, in fact, rootless. They're disconnected from their roots, but they are still people with roots. So that's my thought. My thought is we're going to be different. It's great in my view. I mean, some of the difference is bad, but much of it is interesting and good. We can learn from one another. We can try out different, what Mill called experiments of living. But we can do it recognizing that each of us is coming from somewhere. And that's the point. So the cosmopolitan isn't, I don't mean that there aren't people who reject their roots. That, of course, is a choice that human beings can make. I mean, in a certain sense, I did that by ceasing to be a Protestant. That was a very, very large part of my roots. I spent more than one day a week in prayer till I was a teenager. That's a big thing, went out of my life. I had to learn how to live without it, actually. But I don't feel I left it. I wouldn't say exactly rejected it. I don't agree with it, but I don't hate it. I'm not against it. But that's fine. That everybody has to make their own way. I mean, the liberal cosmopolitans like me have the liberal thought that everybody's in charge of their own life.
Right.
So it's not for anybody else to boss you around and tell you how to live your life. And so if you want to leave the Mormonism of your parents or the Islam of your parents or the conservatism of your parents or the liberalism of your parents, that's for you to decide. And we have to respect each other's right to do that.
So you're positing this the two main options between a kind of cosmopolitan pluralism, a value pluralism, and a range of ends of human life on the cosmopolitan global stage, and a homogenizing universalism that demands that everyone be uniform, as opposed to the acceptance of difference. I think that one area where you can see the distinction clearly, it's helpful perhaps to think these things through, or just to think about them, are the distinctions within Islam. It's very interesting that you teach Al-Ghazali. Am I hearing the music behind your words correctly, that you teach deliverance from error?
No, I'm actually focused very tightly on his teachings about what is called in the Muslim tradition commanding and forbidding. So, and he's a smart philosopher, so he has a way of reshaping the Muslim tradition about that
okay.
I think is very.
I was asking that,
but not that I have any objection to the other part about Sally, but
sure. The reason I was hearing that incorrectly and projecting it at the end of the day is because there he talks about he has this opening insight, which is, it's amazing that all of people who grow up with Jewish parents grow up to be Jews, and people with Christian parents grow up to be Christians, and Muslims grow up to be, and then that's where he begins his search. But you have, coming out of the Islamic world writ large today, another option, which is the Islamist, the option of political Islam, which is a homogenizing, has universal aspirations, and there is one way to be, which is according to the way of the Sharia, and we all have to mix our metaphors, we all have to kowtow to that.
Yes.
Do you think that is it part of your interest as a human being, extending your cosmopolitan curiosity to understanding the inner world of the Islamists? Sayyid Qutb, the leading Islamist thinker of the 20th century, grew up in Egypt. He was the first one one of the first to recognize and recommend Mahfouz, the Nobel Prize winning Egyptian novelist, his greatness, and he has a deep theology. Yes. It's a murderous theology, but it's a deep theology. Do you extend cosmopolitan curiosity to understanding the Islamists, and do you think it's also perhaps today a question of prudence for us to understand them better?
Right. Yes. I mean, look, I think it's really important in political life to understand as well as you can the people who've got a different view of what the state should be doing than you. And so, yes, we need to understand the Islamists. And I think we need to, the word Islamism is used about an awful lot of things, and they're not all the same. And Islam itself has, it divided, already immediately after the life of the Prophet, it divided into the great distinction between Sunni and Shia, but it's got many more divisions now, as of course Christianity has, and Judaism in a smaller way. So it's, and that thought of Al-Ghazali's is connected with the Quranic thought that there shall be no compulsion in religion. Now, whatever that means, and everything in scriptures is contestably interpretable, so people take it to mean lots of different things. But whatever that means, I think the Prophet himself, in the time of the Prophet, thought of Islam, and I know this is not a way many Muslims think, but I'm just trying to look at the history, thought of what he was doing was bringing to the Arabs a message that had already been brought to Jews by Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and to the Christians by Christ and his disciples, the apostles. So, despite what many contemporary Muslims seem to be up to, and I should say there are many more who are not up to this, but despite what many seem to be up to, the idea of turning everybody to Islam is actually deeply un-Quranic, in my view. The Quran has a special softness, really, for the people of the book, and that includes Judaism and Christianity. And it was not the Prophet's idea that Christians should be converted to Islam, or that Jews should be. That was just not. I don't think it's historically plausible that was what he thought. And there's a perfectly good reading of the Quran which is consistent with what I just said. I know, as I say, the interpretation of scripture is a complicated thing, and other people think other things, but I think that's a reasonable way to read. And I know, I mentioned my uncle Aviv. He was a deeply devout Sunni Muslim. He got a lot out of his faith, but he was married to a Methodist, and he had his Christian cousins over for Eid. And he was a deeply tolerant, loving human being, and he's sort of the opposite, in my view, of the picture of Islam that unfortunately has been propagated by a minority of Muslims who are very anti-cosmopolitan, very anti-difference, and so on. So we need to understand that. We need to reach out, I think, as a matter of practical politics, we need to reach out to the other Muslims, of whom there are many, and help them figure out how all of us together can stop the dangers that come from the dangerous minority of difference obliterating Muslims.
Sure. So one of the aspects for me that we've been talking about when you talk about religion, when you talk about ethnic identity, you have a book, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, in your book on Du Bois, Lines of Descent, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the emergence of identity. Identity is a very key idea that you pursued from different angles. So for me, the utility of rooted cosmopolitanism is that you can be rooted in your ethnicity, in your region, even in your country, kind of a positive patriotism, in your religion. Those could be roots, but that you still can identify with and communicate with and have conversations with people from different places and beliefs and backgrounds. And that makes it possible to possibly get to that great good place, to a flourishing world and set of societies that we, I think, aspire to. However, for me, another concept that you've dealt with often is race. And I'd like to discuss for a moment race and philosophy. So I have become, let me put a line in the sand on my own place and belief. So I become a race skeptic and eliminativist. So I critique both the biological and social constructionist arguments for race and argue for an eventual elimination of this deeply flawed concept. And the practice is based on racialization. In a 2010 speech at Colgate University, you said there are no races, but there are racial identities that are real in social life, end of quote. Identities have a feature, a property, that falsehoods have been important parts of their constitution. So I'm curious as to in what ways has your own views on race evolved or changed in the last several decades?
Well, I started out, as usual, I think the easiest way to understand these things is to tell a story. I mean, I came to the United States as an adult, and I, like everybody educated in the West, I knew a lot about the United States. I had a sort of vague sense of that I could follow American politics. I always knew who the American president was wherever I was before that. And I had grown up reading, my father was a Pan-Africanist, so I'd grown up reading, Richard Wright visited us actually when I was a kid. And so did C.L.R. James, who was another interesting figure in the history of Pan-Africanism. And my father was at the 1945 Pan-African Congress with Du Bois and Nkrumah and so on. So we read Baldwin and Du Bois and we followed Dr. King and so on as part of a sort of Pan-Africanist interest in life in the diaspora. So it wasn't that I didn't know anything about the United States or indeed about race in the United States, but I must say that coming here, figuring out how to operate within this racial system made it clearer to me than any amount of reading could have how in many ways I didn't really understand what people were thinking about, in particular about me, because I came to America mostly because my friend Skip Gates said come, and I was fond of him. But and so he and his family, his black family, welcomed me very much, and it was clear to me that the welcome wasn't just that I was a good friend of their son, but somehow it had to do with the fact that I was not white, or perhaps that I was black. But I had to sort of figure out. So for me, being conceived of as black was actually, I always tell people, it was one of the great blessings of coming to America. Was I got to be, as it were, I got all this free kindness from black people. I mean, they were just people who I didn't know from Adam were nice to me. They would smile at me on the street and so on once they decided I was black and so on. So I got a lot of good stuff out of it. But I was also puzzled by it because even educated people seemed. So I was teaching at Yale, moderately well-educated people there, didn't seem to grasp how little this concept had to do with the way biologists thought about human difference, that they seemed to think that it was somehow rooted, that you could settle what race someone was by, as it were, sending them to the doctor, and the doctor would look at something and say, okay, that's your race. So my first set of papers about this was just about trying to show that given what the biologists thought, a lot of what people said about race didn't make much sense. And when you're trying to disagree with a position, it's best to disagree with it in its strongest form. So I did that by disagreeing with some of what Du Bois said. Du Bois was one of the first intellectuals in America to grasp the significance of the new race science that was undermining the biological theories of the 19th century. But it never fully took hold of him. And he slipped back, in my view, from time to time into a more biological essentialist view. All this is controversial, but that was what I thought. So the first thing I wanted to do was to say that was a mistake, that this very smart person had made a mistake, though he had moved somewhat in the direction of the right view. And there's some of what he says struck me as stepping in absolutely the right direction. Okay. The response to a lot of that was quite hostile. or let's say critical, but also hostile. But the important thing is critical. People made arguments, and I thought about them, and gradually I came to see that I'd made too quick a step from thinking that people were wrong about the basis of what I came to call racial identities. Too quick a step from thinking they were wrong about that to thinking that they were not real. I think the project isn't about, I now think, though I didn't then, that the project is your project. It's the project of, as it were, making them unreal. They were made real at a certain point. The modern racial formation, I think, grows out of intellectual developments in Spain after the Reconquest and the idea that Jews and Muslims had something in their bodies that meant that their conversions somehow didn't work, that they were not really converted, and so on, and talk of blood gets used to talk about that, and then that feeds into the way people start to think about Africans when the slave trade takes off, and so even in the early 18th century, a man like Anton Wilhelm AMU, he was born in what's now Ghana, but he ended up as a professor of philosophy in Germany. Even in his day, he wasn't racialized in the way that people came to be in the late 18th and early and in the 19th century. There was still more freedom. I mean, the very fact that the dukes to whom he was given made him their godson and educated him with their children, which is why he ended up as a lawyer and a philosopher, is a sign of something that wouldn't have happened 100 years later. 100 years later, a German princeling wouldn't have done that. So it was made, and though it can be very difficult, anything we can make, we can unmake.
Thank you for saying that.
And so I think we've made this thing, or rather we've made a set of things, because race works differently in different places. And that's another thing that people don't seem to understand. So that I'm definitely not a negro in Brazil, because that is a term for skin color, and I'm brown. And so they have a different system. And in Brazil, full siblings can be of different races, because they can look different. I mean, that's true in my family. I have three nephews whose father is Norwegian, and one of them's my color, and one of them's sort of Aryeh's color, and one of them's sort of in between. And in Brazil, they would be of different races. But in the United States, they're all black, even though one of them looks like a blonde Norwegian. So, right. I mean, in our system. So there isn't one system, but there are lots of systems, and in those systems, for the big ones, appearance matters, but it isn't decisive, because, as I say, you can be like Walter White, who was the head of the NAACP and was white and had blue eyes, but he was a black man in America. But that wouldn't work in Brazil. So you can. There it is, and there are these many systems. Good things come out of them, like all things in human, good things come out of them as well as bad things. All that free kindness I got from black people in America was a gift to me, and I'm grateful for it. The solidarity of black people is now helping Africa to some extent, because African Americans are doing things for Africa. That is, they're involved in projects of development projects and political projects to help African development. That's all very welcome in my view. But very many bad things have been done in the name of it, and it was basically put together for bad reasons. It was basically put together as an ideology, modern racism, in order to provide Christians who should have known better some kind of rationalization for enslaving black people, I think. So we certainly can't leave it the way it is.
Well, I have a quick follow-up question. Thank you so much for that.
Yes, good.
I'm wondering if making a clear distinction between race and culture could help us along that path. I ask because two of the people that in spirit the Omni American Future Project, which Aryeh and I co-direct and lead, Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray. And they both made very clear distinctions between race and culture, and way more emphasized culture through storytelling, meaning, values, the arts, music, blues and jazz, than race per se. So is that distinction one of the steps along the line of moving in that direction of eliminating it?
Yes. Look, I think it's very helpful, and this is an intellectual process that begins in American anthropology with someone like Boas, trying to tease out these distinctions.
Ashley Montague,
there's a
Zora Neale Hurston, who studied, of course, with Boas.
Yes, with Boas. Yes. But that notion, the anthropologist notion of culture, which sort of goes back to Tyler, who was the first professor of anthropology at Oxford, and somebody who wrote it about the same time, namely Matthew Arnold, his notion of culture, those are two distinct notions of culture. They're both very important, and it's important not to racialize either of them. But I think of Ellison and even more perhaps Murray as being on the Arnoldian side of culture. The aspects of culture they were interested in were the things like the folk tales that someone like Zora Neale Hurston would have, built on as well in her literary work, but also the rare rabbit stories and so on, the African American folklore, but American folklore more generally, the folklore of Native Americans and the folklore that came from Europe with many American traditions, European American traditions. So we should distinguish between race and anthropological culture, because that's absolutely, you'll just get your mind in a terrible mess if you don't do that. And there's nothing, it's a kind of mess that African Americans sometimes get into when they arrive in Africa and they expect to be understood. But, there are, 8,000 languages in Africa or something like that. And so the idea that there's an African culture is sort of bizarre. So in that anthropological sense, it's very important to distinguish these things. The Black world is not a cultural homogeneity. It's incredibly, the African diaspora is incredibly, and Africa itself, incredibly heterogeneous in that cultural sense. But in the high culture sense, the sort of Arnold, best that has been thought and said kind of sense, the really important thing, I think, is the thought that's central to the book Omni Americans, which is that the best of it belongs to all of us. When I'm not going to allow some Chinese person to tell me I can't use Confucius. Not that they would, I hope. And I'm not going to tell anybody that I'm not going to accept from anybody who tells me that I can only draw on the Can traditions or West African traditions or African traditions, or for that matter, British traditions from my mother. If something's worth knowing or studying or reading or listening to or looking at, they were close to Bearden. And they had thoughts about the visual arts. Those do not belong to any ethno-racial group. They don't belong to any class. They don't belong to any nation. They are the common property of humankind. Anybody who wants to take them seriously is entitled to do so. And if you're in a position to help them, you should, in my view. So that's... whereas, of course, some people make the race-culture distinction and then tie culture back again to ethnic identity.
Yeah.
And that's not, I don't mean, of course, anthropologists notice that there are differences in the anthropological culture of different places. And, how you feel at home is going to depend a little bit on which of the ones you grew up in. And people are different. They grew up in different ones. But you can shift. You can become comfortable with more things. You can become uncomfortable with things that were part of the culture. I grew up in a place where people had servants who were not respected, and I was used to that, but I don't like it anymore. I think it's bad, and it's getting better. I mean, people in Ghana recognize now, at least some of them, that that's not how you should treat people.
Can I give you a quick interrupt for a quick second?
Absolutely, yes.
It was one time.
I'm going to go on and on.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
I
happen to have known Marcellus since 1993, and I was over. Yeah, I was over at his place one time, and he had someone who was, a woman who was cleaning and stuff. And I noticed now he's from New Orleans. He's grounded in a certain Black American Southern tradition of manners and respect for your elders and that type of thing. But I noticed that he was so respectful, even deferential to this older Black woman who was cleaning his apartment. And it's something that so when you talk about, not respecting it, I guess that's a part of a cultural inheritance, your orientation to others in terms of the different stations and positions.
Yes. And this is when I said that the world isn't, I don't want the world to become homogeneous. I don't mean that I don't think there are things that it would be nice to spread everywhere. And respect for the people who work for you is something I'd like to see spread everywhere, as is a paradigm of gender equality. And that will change places because women aren't equal to men in most places. Women of the same class as men are not treated as equally in many places. And I'd like a world in which that wasn't true. And so would most women. So that's good. I've got half the world on my side at least. Yes. So I think you can, on the one hand, there are things that you're used to. And one of the challenges of the absorption of immigrants into a society is to learn to live, is for them to learn how we live here. And of course, the answer is we live in many different ways. But also for us to learn that it's okay that they bring with them things that seem a little bit odd to us. And then we have to rub along together and figure out which of those things has to stop. You can't do female genital cutting if you bring a girl child to America. And which of those things are permissible? Yes, you can continue to be an Ahmadiyya Muslim or a Sunni Muslim or a Catholic from Brazil. I mean, those are all within the range of things that we absolutely say you can do. But now the way identities work, ethnic identities work, there are some ethnic identities that you can sort of join simply by picking up the anthropological culture. And there's a long pattern in many places, for example, of women adopting the ethnicity of their husbands, becoming. I'm Italian-American woman. I marry a Polish-American guy. I start cooking kielbasa, and I go to the Polish Catholic Church and not the Italian Catholic Church. But there are ways of coming to. I've been. My husband and I have had seders together for the last whatever it is, 35, 40 years. So I guess I know as much about seders as any 20-year-old Jewish person. But I'm not Jewish because of that. So there are we have these rules about which things you can join by just getting the culture and which things you can't join that way. And those rules, I think, in a way reflect they reflect a way of thinking about things that I'm not sure that I'm terribly happy with, but I can't ignore them. I mean, because identities are things we make together. I don't make any identity. They're all things we make together, and they're made by the people inside and the people outside. Black people don't control Black identity. Americans control Black identity in America. Reasonable white Americans are going to be extremely respectful of what Black people think about Black identity, but Black people have to persuade them. They can't just command them to think about Black people in any particular way. And Black people, anyway, are going to have different views about how to be Black. So they can't even command each other. So we got to be dialogical about this. We got to be in conversation with one another about these things. If I am down with the requests or the demands, if you like, of trans people about how to think about their identity, to the extent that I can make sense of what I've been asked to think, I'm happy to think it. But they had to persuade me. They couldn't just declare, this is how you must think. And they have persuaded me, so I'm persuaded. But it was part of their job, and they've done a pretty good job, I think. The trans movement has done a pretty good job of getting the rest of us to see why they're asking for what they're asking for, and that it's not going to make my world fall apart if they get it.
So you've mentioned that cosmopolitan conversation doesn't necessarily lead to a kind of relativism. There are still things that you, as you're talking about the relationship to those who work for us and other things, scientific and moral and otherwise, that you think there's a better and a worse, and we need to spread the light. Now, you tell an anecdote. You bring in your book, Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, you bring a very telling anecdote about the difficulty of this sometime and a kind of imperative in having cosmopolitan conversations to begin where people are. And that really cuts against the grain of how a lot of people function. So if maybe we can briefly we'll retell the anecdote, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to negotiate this tension. I can tell the story. You can tell the story, whatever you would prefer.
No, do tell the story.
Okay. So you tell, and you'll correct me if I'm, okay. This is an anthropological anecdote. Mm-hmm. So there's an anthropologist in a remote place. There's a medical missionary in a remote place where people are taking well water and they're bringing it to their children who are dying of diarrhea. So the medical missionary says, look, folks, boil the water. It'll kill the bacteria. And the locals go, what the hell are bacteria? And they continue drinking the well water. And the children keep dying. And so the medical missionary goes, well, all right, I have to get inside their head. And he goes, you know what? Boil the water. It'll drive out the spirits. And I go, we'll boil the water now. Hmm. And they boil the water. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful anecdote. And what it says is that we have to go against a very modern inclination to attack prejudices head on, to attack error. We have to respect error. We have to respect authorities and conventions and begin there and ascend to a more comprehensive perspective. That's kind of a pre-modern view. It's not really a modern view, but you're saying that it's essential for us to recover.
You've got to you've got to start from where you both are. I mean, it's so obvious when you put it that way. Where else could you start from? I mean, you got to start. You could start having I'm the Enlightenment. People are dying. People are dying, and I'm, whether you like it or not, boil the damn water. Right, but that's a matter. That's basically walking away from the person to somewhere else, and they won't listen. They won't come with you. So, right. So the key thing is, I mean, the worrying thing in that story, of course, is a bit manipulative. On the other hand, the children aren't dying. And we have to learn to. So the important truth in that story is that boiling the water saves lives. And to convince people of that, you have to talk to them in their conceptual language. And so that's what that story says. Now, you can, of course, use that kind of manipulation to get people to do things that are bad for them. And you can do it in a way that is disrespectful and so on. So all of those other things matter too. But the key thing is, this is why, there's a tradition in modern American philosophical liberalism which says that we ask our fellow citizens to come to the public square only with what we always call public reasons, public reason. But I say, let's everybody come to the square with whatever they've got. And let's figure it out. And if you tell me that it's really important that we don't allow abortions because the fetus is ensouled at the age of 0, at the moment of conception, I'm going to say, well, I'm interested to know you think that, but I don't think that, and so that isn't a reason for me. You can't get me to agree with you by telling me that. So if you want me to agree with you, you better tell me something that relates to how I think about these things. So I don't mind people bringing whatever they want, whatever they think matters. But then I'm allowed to bring what I think matters, and I'm allowed to say to them, look, I'm sorry, but that doesn't matter to me because I don't believe that, or I don't believe that matters. So, so let's come as we are. Let's listen to what other people say. But as in that story, let's also think, can I put my point in a way that will bring my fellow conversationalists around to seeing what's important in this situation? A lot of people, I remember once having a conversation at a conference about immigration with some people in which I got angry because they were talking about all these abstract principles. But the effect of the principles they were talking about was that husbands were being separated from wives, parents from children, and people who were in danger were being denied entry. You've got to focus on the important things. I don't care. Any principle that tells me that you shouldn't, it's just fine to separate couples doesn't stand a chance of being a principle that I'm going to accept. You need to focus on the things that matter. And I think once you get people to think about the things that matter, they'll see that whatever their abstract thoughts about, rights of sovereignty and all that, in the end, if two people love each other and marry, then whatever state they're in, one of them is in, ought to let the other one in to be with them, right? That should be morally obvious. And the fact that people have rights states have rights to do various things, and that is very interesting. But they shouldn't exercise those rights if they have them, if that's the result. So let's start with where we are. I've been telling a story recently, which I only sort of recently realized how important this was to me. But when I was a kid, my grandmother sold her house. And because she moved into a cottage next door, this was in England, we became neighbors with the person she sold the house to, in the house that I'd spent much of my childhood in. And he was a very, very right-wing English politician. And I was not a very right-wing political figure, and nor was my grandmother, because her husband had been a member of the Labour Party, as had my great-grandfather. And most of our cousins and relatives. So it wasn't obvious why we should become friends, but we did. And he was older. He wasn't as old as my grandmother, but he was older. And he didn't have any children or grandchildren. And he taught me how to fish, trout fish. I went to the college that I went to because he drove me there. My parents were in Ghana. It was his college, obviously. He introduced me to people there, and I didn't have any reason to pick any particular college at Cambridge. I didn't have any Cambridge connections. So that's where I went, and I was an undergraduate there, a graduate student there, a fellow there, and now I'm an honorary fellow of the college that he gave to me. And we disagreed about everything. And he was wrong. Let me put it this way. He was wrong about everything.
From your perspective.
Right?
Right.
From my point of view. One of our longest discussions, because we were driving across England to go to Cambridge, was I was trying to persuade him not to vote for the reintroduction of capital punishment in England.
Hmm.
And we had this respectful many-hour conversation. And he dropped me off at my grandmother's, and he said, "Well, Anthony, you won all the arguments, but I'm going to go fuck out." And he did. And furthermore, I just checked last year, and I looked in the parliamentary records. He was the first person to speak in favor of it in Parliament. So, but I couldn't not like him. And I think it's very important I'm telling this story now, not to you, but when I tell it, because I think we're in a state of, in our country and in many countries, it's true in Britain now as well, that we won't talk to people because we think they got bad politics.
Right.
I mean, this man's politics was so bad that he was the guy who found a seat for arguably the most racist member of the English Parliament. So I don't mean, but he wasn't too racist, because he was nice to me himself. So I think it's really, really crucial. This is part of the cosmopolitan package, is conversation across difference at home as well as abroad. And democracy requires it. Democracy requires a willingness to engage with people who you think are wrong. And wrong in non-trivial ways. Not wrong in the details, but wrong in the depths. I have very little sympathy with a lot of the animating impetuses of contemporary American conservatism. But I got to talk to those people, and I hope they're willing to talk to me.
Who are they? I know, Greg, we want to wrap it up. You're going to ask about Omni Americans, but this is a really interesting point, and it's alive in the political field. When you're talking about American conservatism, are you talking about intellectual conservatives, real intellectual conservatives from National Review, or are you talking about the MAGA populists? Who exactly are you referring to, or both, or others?
So I should say that there's good evidence that below the surface of these political identities, there's a lot more inhomogeneity than you would think. So some of those MAGA people are going to be homophobic, and some of them aren't. And some of them are going to be wives, subject yourself to your husband's kind of conservatives, and some of them aren't. So one thing, since we don't know each other, we don't know things like that. But the sort of things I disagree with, I mean, I think unlike actually many people, I don't think that globalization was bad for this country. I don't think that. So this is for the intellectual conservatives. I do not believe that immigration has been bad in this country. We've handled it badly in some respects, and we've handled globalization badly in some respects. But in themselves, I don't think there's anything wrong with either of them. I don't think that trans people should be denied access to bathrooms that they identify with, and so on. I don't think that Toni Morrison's novels should be banned from school, high school, or middle school libraries. I mean, there are lots of things that a lot of these people think that I just don't agree with. But we're not going to make progress on any of those things if I'm not willing to listen to why they think those things. And
they're not willing to listen to you.
Yeah. I mean, and they may not, but I mean, in the end, human beings are interesting enough that it's worth talking to them, even if at the end of it, all you've got is a deeper understanding of what they're like, and it's still terrible.
All right, Anthony. So we always like to end our conversations. And of course, thank you so much for your time and insights and sharing with us. The subtitle of our podcast is the Omni American Podcast. And we would like to know what you think the word Omni American means. What does that mean to you?
Well, the thought behind that word for me is that thought about the fundamental thought is twofold. One is the Arnoldian thought that the best that has been thought and said belongs to everybody. But the other thought in Murray, which I think is deeply true, is that what's attractive and powerful and interesting about American culture in the Arnoldian sense comes, the Black people are have a central part in the history of that. And that you don't make sense. You can't tell a story about American culture that ignores the fact that at the heart of our distinctive forms of music, that at the heart of some of our poetic and literary forms, that at the heart of some of our linguistic creativity, and at the heart of American speech are things that were put there by American individuals and communities who were Black. And that's now, of course, Murray would have said if you push that too far, of course, a lot of it comes from people who were white, and a lot of it comes from people who are Native American. All of us. This is, I mean, I'm very, very happy to be an American now, and very delighted to have been invited into the privilege of American citizenship. But that's part of what's attractive to me about this place, is that it's Ishmael Reed used to say, the world is here. And so in a way, you can do your cosmopolitanism at home. You don't actually have to get on a boat or a plane. So that's what I think when you say Omni-American to me. I think of that. I wish I'd known Murray. Skip, of course, knew him pretty well and spent a lot of time with him. And I think I met him with Skip, and I certainly met Bearden with Skip, but I didn't really know him. But I admire that temperament, and it's in a way, this is one of the sort of burdens of Skip's piece about him. In a way, that's the best way of being a race man. The best way of celebrating Black culture is to say it's great, it belongs to all of us, and I have a special tinge of pride in it because it connects in some way with my identity, but it belongs to us all, and I like that thought.
It's nice to think that the best that has been thought and said about American identity has been thought and said and written and played musically, oftentimes by Black Americans.
It sounds like you're describing what we call rooted cosmopolitanism. The best that has been thought and said, that's a cosmopolitan aspiration and actualization, but it's rooted at the same time.
Yes, everybody's putting in their bit. I mean, you mentioned patriotism. I mean, in a more academic place, I once wrote a paper called Cosmopolitan Patriots, because I think that there are different ways of, you can think of people normally think of patriotism as people who love their country. I think it's, in a way, something more complicated than that. It's people who think of the country as profoundly theirs, which means sometimes you hate it because this thing that's profoundly yours is doing a terrible thing. I mean, when this country was persecuting gay people in the 1950s, or when it was subjecting the Black part of the population to appalling inequality and degradation, an American patriot should have been ashamed and upset and angry and not loving America at all. So, but I think so. When we have the burden of identity is that the best that's been done in the name of your identity is yours, but so is the worst. And as Walter Benjamin said, every monument of civilization is also a monument of barbarism. Every beautiful pyramid has a bunch of bodies buried underneath it who were forced to build it. That's not Walter Benjamin, that's me. So our relation, I suppose what I feel is our relation to identity should be more complicated than most people's relations to their identities, because we should recognize that it's burdens as well as privileges.
Well, it's been not a burden, but a privilege to have you on with us, Anthony Appiah.
A privilege and a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Good. It's very nice to talk to you about.
Thank you for watching us on Straight Ahead, the Omni American podcast.
Subscribe today and fight for a future in which the many join as one against bigotry.